Tonight on MovieDrome, the kind of film which should make everybody happy. A movie which was both a popular hit and a critical succès de scandale, Halloween. Halloween was directed in 1978 by John Carpenter. It's one of the earliest and most imitated of that overworked and seemingly endlessly popular genre, the serial killer, maniac, stalker on the loose in pursuit of hapless teenagers movie. The kind of film where you know beforehand exactly what's going to happen. Of course the teenagers are going to split up and explore the madhouse in total darkness in their underwear. What else would they do? I must confess that when I saw Halloween in 1978, I found it ridiculous and utterly uninvolving. But I am stupid. The sort of spoilsport idiot who says, I wouldn't do that, or that doesn't make sense. In the same way I can't find any point of entry to Mrs. Doubtfire or the piano. They just seem ridiculous to me. Maybe I'd feel different if I hadn't grown up on Dead of Night and Easy Rider. Well, anyway, tonight's film features Donald Pleasance in the kind of role he always seems to play. His performance, like Halloween itself, received extravagant praise from some of the most eminent film critics in the UK on its release. It also features Jamie Lee Curtis in the role of the plucky and resilient heroine. Jamie Lee is, of course, the daughter of Janet Leigh, star of that even more celebrated maniac-at-large movie, Psycho. This is just one of Halloween's many conscious or self-conscious references to other movies. Carpenter even goes so far as to use video extracts from earlier films like Forbidden Planet and The Thing, a movie he was to remake a few years later. Much has been made of the persistent use of Steadicam in Halloween and of the camera as killer's point of view, which here in MovieDrome you will experience in the full majesty of its original cinemascope form. This technique has been done to death ever since, although devotees of the genre would say never to such ambiguous good effect. For this reviewer, John Carpenter's best film is still his first, the seriously funny space saga Dark Star, made as a student film at USC and co-written by Dan O'Bannion. He also deserves credit for the extraordinary first half of They Live, his 1988 alien takeover movie. One fact for true Carpenter buffs: the villain of tonight's piece is called Michael Myers, reputedly the director's odd way of saying thanks to the chief exec of Miracle Films. If it's a good film, it's a miracle. Distributors in Britain of Assault on Precinct 13. But for now, trick or treat, here it is, Halloween.
Trancers is another example of the low-budget science fiction that came out of Los Angeles in the early 1980s. Some of it, like Night of the Comet, which is also part of this season, was made by the new independent companies like Atlantic. Some was made by the venerable Roger Corman at his studio in Venice, California, a former lumberyard. And a lot of it, including Trancers, came from an independent outfit called Empire, run by a man called Charles Band, who is the director of this film. Most of this science fiction rips off Alien or Star Wars. Trancers is a rip-off of Blade Runner with a substantial nod to the Terminator. In that sense, its taste is excellent. It has the time-traveling cops and the flying police cars. But its eyes are bigger than its appetite. Everything in this film is much too clean. Even the street people are freshly washed and laundered. Its greatest assets are its Father Christmas scene, which is fantastic, and its locations. It was all filmed in the industrial wasteland south of Los Angeles, which really does look like a cross between the 1920s and a post-apocalyptic landscape. Also, don't fail to note the sequence in the LA River, a huge concrete channel which divides the city in two and provides so many movies with locations. Merry Christmas.
Now on MovieDrome, a very fine variation on the same theme as Escape from Alcatraz. Robert Bresson's A Man Escaped. Made in 1956, it's based on the true story of André de Vigny, a French officer who was imprisoned by the Germans and the Vichy collaboration government at Montluc jail in 1943. Bresson was a former painter and scriptwriter who was himself a prisoner of war from June 1940 to April 41. Perhaps for that reason, A Man Escaped is quite unlike Escape from Alcatraz or any other film in this familiar genre. The story exists entirely in small details. The minute mechanisms of the hero's escape plan, the matter-of-fact approach to violence, which is quite terrifying although entirely unseen, the natural use of sound, and the absolutely real performances. No actors were used in this film. That's part of Bresson's unique style as well. He thinks that actors are incapable of projecting the truth. All they can do is act, and Bresson isn't interested in acting. Instead, he always works with real people. Bresson's most famous film is The Trial of Joan of Arc, made 6 years later in 1962. It too has a spare visual style in which abstract details communicate much of the story. It too employs non-actors in an intensely passionate and revealing way. Given that the French cinema has now degenerated, like our own, to the level of the rock video, it's a great pleasure to present this classic film and great adventure movie, A Man Escaped.
Tonight's film is Night of the Comet, a science fiction opus made in Los Angeles in 1984. Its premise is very similar to Day of the Triffids, a British science fiction movie based on the book by John Wyndham. Its working title was Teenage Comet Zombies. Night of the Comet is a mixture of the wide-eyed 1950s type of science fiction movie and the post-apocalyptic, punky science fiction style. It has a lot of time-lapse photography, whereby the camera runs slowly, shooting only 2 or 3 frames every second, and as a result, cloud formations or what have you go extremely fast. It also has a lot of colored filters on the camera lens, whereby an ordinary street or sky or whatever is made to look weird. But what it doesn't have really is a sense of driving manic purpose. Compare it to The Incredible Shrinking Man or to The Thing, both part of this season. They were made in the 1950s and don't have the same attempts at humor. They're better, I think. Night of the Comet does feature one essential cult element in the presence of Mary Woronov, the very tall actress who starred in many Paul Bartel films. It also contains Dick Rude from Repo Man and Chris Peterson from Suburbia as mutant punk supermarket bag boys. As often with this kind of film, you really sort of wish the villains were the heroes.
American Werewolf in London isn't strictly speaking a cult film. It was far too popular with large numbers of people and made lots of money. Nevertheless, it is part of a very honorable cult genre, the werewolf/vampire film. The rules of these films are standardized, and if you're watching this, you probably already know them. For beginners, vampires are blood-drinking living corpses whose mere bite can turn you into one of their number. Werewolves are people who turn into wolves or wolf-like humanoids every full moon. Their bite turns other humans into werewolves. Vampires can only be killed by fire, removal of the head, or a stake through the heart. Werewolves can only be killed by a silver bullet or the SAS. American Werewolf in London was directed by John Landis, an American whose most notable cult feature was the Blues Brothers. He's also very famous for his work on Twilight Zone. It's influenced by Dead of Night, a classic British horror film, which also forms part of this season. The film contains every conceivable song in which the word moon appears. It features a nice cameo from Mr. Frank Oz, the Muppets genius and director of the very funny Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. He plays Mr. Collins, the man from the US Embassy. You can also spot Rick Mayall playing chess in a pub called The Slaughtered Lamb alongside Brian Glover, who's a very good actor. The film's a weird mixture of naive comedy and apocalyptic violence with an abrupt ending. If you flip through all the credits, you'll see that the film is dedicated to Their Royal Highnesses, the Prince and Princess of Wales, on the occasion of their marriage, which should set you up very well for the national anthem at the end.
Good evening. Tonight's film has a historical subject. It's an epic spanning an entire continent. It was directed by a legendary Italian director, has scores of plots and subplots, thousands of extras, lavish sets, authentic period props and costumes, and a highly acclaimed musical score. It's also much too long. If it had been directed last year by Bernardo Bertolucci, it would have won a dozen Oscars. But it was made in 1966 by Sergio Leone, and it's a Western called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the third in a trilogy of films that began with A Fistful of Dollars in 1963. All the Italians that made that film were so nervous at that time about making a spaghetti Western because it was one of the first, but they all masqueraded behind American pseudonyms. Leone chose the name Bob Robertson. They were also very concerned to have an American actor in the lead role. But the first actor that Leone approached, James Coburn, turned him down. The second person he approached was an American expatriate living in Rome called Richard Harrison. But Harrison didn't want to be in a Western done by Italians, and he turned him down too. Leone said, "Do you know anybody else I could approach?" And Harrison said, "Yeah, I know a guy in LA. He hasn't got any work. He might do it." Leone said, "Has he done any films before?" And Harrison said, "Not really, but he did play Rowdy Yates on Rawhide." The actor's name was Clint Eastwood, and the rest is history.
This is BBC Two. Now Alex Cox introduces tonight's MovieDrome presentation of The Terminator. Although this film has been edited for television, some viewers may still find it disturbing.
Terminator is a 1980s LA science fiction film in the style of Trancers or Teenage Comet Zombies, which, as you may recall, we saw last year. It contains all the necessary elements of the subgenre: punks, chases down alleys, tracking shots through the cop shop, obsession with guns. What raises it above the level of the normal are the script and the bad man, who gets star billing in the film. The script is credited to James Cameron and Gail Ann Hurd, respectively director and producer. This is a little misleading, though, since the real source of the story is an old episode of The Outer Limits called Soldier, the story of an assassin sent back in time to kill someone and change the future. Soldier was written by Harlan Ellison.
Terminator's greatest asset, of course, is Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was the first of a series of big-budget science fiction action films which included Predator, The Running Man, and most recently the $75 million Total Recall. What can you say about Schwarzenegger? Well, he's Austrian, he has enormous muscles, he obviously has a sense of humor, and he's very rich. He's also a Republican, and married to the daughter of one of America's most influential political dynasties. Unfortunately, Arnold isn't a native-born American, and so he can never be president. But he's still doing his best. So sit back, slam a few shells into the chamber of your pump action, load up the 30-06, and slip the safety off your 357 as Arnold does his bit for truth, justice, and the almighty box office. If you're interested in learning more about this film, the other films we're going to show, or the ones we showed last year or the year before, you can acquire for a very modest fee a MovieDrome book, which also tells you where you can get stills and soundtrack albums. Terminator cost about $6 million. Terminator 2, now in production, is budgeted at $60 million, more than half of which is fees. $60 million is what the United States spends in military assistance to El Salvador in 1.5 months. It's also what the wing of a stealth bomber costs. Makes you think. Or maybe not. I'll be back. More mayhem next week with the rarely seen extraordinary honeymoon killers.
And now on BBC Two, here's Alex Cox to introduce this week's offering from the MovieDrome.
Vamp is the perfect MovieDrome film. I don't mean a perfect film artistically. This is no performance. Nor is the direction on a par with, say, Joseph Losey's in The Prowler or Orson Welles in Touch of Evil. Actor-wise, you're not about to see any Charlton Hestons or Joan Crawfords here. Vamp is not a perfect film by any means, but it is a perfect MovieDrome film. A rarely seen cult exploitation movie with irrelevant actors, average direction, a daft script borrowing from other equally daft movies, and guest appearances by such cult luminaries as Grace Jones and Lisa Lyon, plus original furniture by Keith Haring and Andy Warhol. Vamp is the story of some horrid college fraternity boys who go to the big city to hire a stripper to perform in their clubhouse. Could anything sound more awful? Don't worry, it's going to be great. Luckily for us, the film is directed without any pretension. The actors are completely mindless. They just point these big red and blue lights at them and go. Actually, there's one good actor hidden in there too. His name's Sandy Barron, and he plays the cockroach-eating nightclub owner, Vic. Grace Jones ain't bad either. It's her best role to date, even better than the James Bond film. In fact, they ought to let Richard Wenk, the director of Vamp, loose on a couple of James Bond films. Or maybe the next Batman. He certainly keeps the pace going, though he's no Herc Hervey. Like Hervey's Carnival of Souls, also in this year's collection, and the Romero Living Dead pictures, Vamp owes a considerable debt to the old EC, alias educational, horror comics, which if you're very, very old, you may remember were the subject of parliamentary debate and banning in the 1950s.
These comics, with titles like The Crypt of Terror and The Vault of Horror, had a sort of gleeful blankness about them, till the mask of fear was torn away and ultimate horror revealed in the final panel on the last page. Anyway, without more ado, here's Vamp, the first film of Richard Wenk from New World Pictures. Tonight, a rarely seen drama set during World War II. It's The Hill, directed by Sidney Lumet, the American director most famous for his urban dramas like Network and Dog Day Afternoon. It was made in 1964, the year after Lumet's tense nuclear war drama Failsafe, and the year before he made the then sensational Pawnbroker. The Hill is the story of a British camp for army prisoners in North Africa. Among the convicts are Sean Connery, Ossie Davis, and Roy Kinnear. It's an outstanding cast. The officers are played by Ian Bannon and Michael Redgrave, and Harry Andrews is Regimental Sergeant Major Wilson, who has designed a Mayan death cult-style pyramid in the center of the prison compound, which the men are forced endlessly to run up and down. This hill is, of course, a metaphor for all sorts of stuff. The army, war, obedience, and society with all its vile institutions and demented sexual sadism. The film is so brilliantly photographed, though, that none of this symbolic stuff intrudes until the end, when the film's origins as a stage play do unfortunately become apparent. The camera work was by Oswald Ossie Morris. And how come nobody's called Ossie anymore? He also photographed Moby Dick, The Guns of Navarone, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and Sleuth. The opening shot is one of those long takes that you read about in film textbooks. It's certainly on a par with the famous opening of Orson Welles' Touch of Evil. The film uses wide-angle lenses and long takes very effectively, particularly in the scene where the men are introduced and in the interiors. They even manage to make a jail cell interesting. As the warden says in Escape from Alcatraz, this isn't about reforming malefactors. There's no possibility of making good people here, only good prisoners, or in this case, soldiers. As Connery observes, in Andrews' prison, even the screws are doing time. Given how much of The Hill is excellent, it's strange that it isn't more celebrated. Certainly it's equal to Lumet's other work, which sadly has degenerated lately into formulaic studio films. Perhaps The Hill is largely unknown because it's so odd. A British war film with an American director and a relentlessly pessimistic take on everything. No one gets off the hook here. There is no room for sentimentality, and the script remains cruel and strong and plausible almost until the very end. Sometimes also known as Kill and Say Your Prayers, Requiescant is a spaghetti western directed by Carlo Lizzani in 1968. Lizzani was a journalist and film critic who published a major survey of Italian film, Il Cinema Italiano, in 1953. He's also a stage director, seen here at the opening of one of his plays in Rome, giving encouragement to a young admirer. Unlike Godard, whose leftist ideology led him to experiment with film form in a way guaranteed to alienate the general audience, Pisani was attempting to communicate with as large a group of people as possible. Popular cinema seems to require considerable dollops of violence and the depiction of women as victims, and hence may be a dubious vehicle for social reform. Nevertheless, some of the best art has a moral purpose and contains a message. Consider Picasso's Guernica, a great painting born from the artist's grief and outrage over Nazi atrocities during the Spanish Civil War. Anyway, about this spaghetti western. Requiescant, as in Requiescant in Pace, Rest in Peace, or in this case Pieces, is the name given to the central character, played by Lou Castel. Castel is an interesting actor, little seen. He was the bad guy in A Bullet for the General and appeared sinisterly playing the piano in Wim Wenders' The American Friend. Here he's a young innocent found wandering in the desert, a trainee preacher with the soul of a murdered gunfighter crying out for revenge. You get the picture. The film has a dark sense of humor and some genuinely bizarre moments that rival anything in Johnny Guitar or Django Kill. Check out the scene among the skeletons or the ingenious murder games. Even more interesting is some of the casting. Mark Damon is an excellent villain, and several of the Pasolini actors, including Ninetto Davoli and Franco Citti, appear, as indeed does that great Italian director Pasolini himself, in the role of a machine gun packing priest. The previous year, Nizzani made another western with the magnificent title of The Hills Run Red. Unfortunately, the film, directed under the pseudonym of Lee W. Beaver, didn't live up to the promise of its fine name. Requiescant does. Like Face to Face, Requiescant works on a psychological as well as a political level. Here, as a weird meditation on how biology determines destiny in the form of a boy born with gunfighter's genes. G-E-N-E-S. For the discerning enthusiast, we proffer the new MovieDrome guide. You can find Cape Fear is a film of some notoriety. When it came to Britain in 1962, the censor was aghast. He demanded 6 minutes of cuts before granting the film an X certificate. Tonight we've restored those cuts. Prepare to be corrupted. The problem wasn't with anything that happened on screen, so much as with the character played by Robert Mitchum, Max Cady. Cady is a sex offender who turns up in a small Florida town and proceeds to terrorize the local barrister, played by Gregory Peck, his wife, Polly Bergen, and their 12-year-old daughter, who wears a push-up bra. Cape Fear has a very obvious screenplay which lays the plot out clearly every chance it gets. It's very modern in that respect, modern in its banality and inability to leave anything to the imagination. The director is J. Lee Thompson, who was born in Bristol but made most of his films in the United States. He too is a straightforward bread and margarine director, best known for The Guns of Navarone and Charles Bronson and Chuck Norris epics. What's best about Cape Fear is its performances. The supporting cast, particularly Telly Savalas with hair and Martin Balsam, very good. Peck and Mitchum are just great. Peck never fails to deliver the goods, always communicating a sense of decency, bewilderment, anger, and deep frustration. Recently, he played the writer Ambrose Bierce in The Dreadful Old Gringo. He was the only good thing in the film. Max Cady may be Mitchum's basest and best performance. He plays it cool, sexy, smart, and really evil. It's the sincerity of Peck's and Mitchum's performances that make Cape Fear a good film. Cape Fear made a sizable impact on the minds of certain film directors. Nicholas Roeg filled his picture Track 29 with references to it, even beginning with a shot of the Cape Fear Bridge. And Martin Scorsese has just remade it in the Florida Everglades, with De Niro in the Mitchum role, Nick Nolte as Gregory Peck, and Jessica Lange as Polly Bergen. Mitchum, Balsam and Savalas all make cameo appearances in this Scorsese movie, which is that director's first foray into CinemaScope. Apparently the music in the Scorsese version is the original score by Bernard Herrmann. In the end, Cape Fear doesn't entirely work. Florida is one of the most brutal police states in the USA, and if a man like Max Cady were really to show up and start threatening the public prosecutor, he wouldn't be around for very long. But the American cinema likes to pursue this fiction that all a crook has to do is hire himself a lawyer and the copper's hands are tied. It's a great dramatic contrivance used in all the Dirty Harry films. Here Martin Molson tells us, you can't arrest a man for something that might be in his mind. That is dictatorship. Tell that to the Los Angeles Police Department, or to Leonard Peltier, or Geronimo Pratt. You might even try it on the US Supreme Court, which recently decided that coerced confessions are constitutional. Where was Amnesty International that day?
Tonight on MovieDrome we present Escape from New York, co-written and directed by John Carpenter. Carpenter is the director of a series of horror and science fiction films, the most famous and successful of which is Halloween. His first film, and in some ways still his best, was a science fiction comedy called Dark Star, about surfers in space. Dark Star was written by one Dan O'Banion, who later wrote Alien. Alien, in spite of a much larger budget and the inimitable chocolate box photography of Ridley Scott, is essentially the same story as Dark Star. Mad alien aboard spaceship, picking up the crew, minus the very funny humor of Carpenter's original super low-budget film. Carpenter is a variable director, and in some ways Escape from New York is one of his more disappointing films. Sometimes he really pulls it off, as with Assault on Precinct 13 or his remake of The Thing. Once he made an almost brilliant film, the highly underrated They Live. They Live is one of the few recent American films to feature a homeless person as a hero, and for the first hour it's a mesmeric revelation of how yuppies and the Soho video and advertising crowd are really aliens who, having taken over the planet, are busy throwing the rest of us out of work. They Live falls down at the end, stumbling as do many modern science fiction films into a dull welter of chases down corridors and high-tech gunfire. And even in this, it's not alone. Similar melodies affect Total Recall and Terminator 2. Escape from New York really should have been a brilliant film. Its premise is that 5 years from now, all order has broken down, and New York has been turned into a vast, maximum security prison, encircled by a giant world. Budgeted in 1981 at $7 million, it was Carpenter's most expensive film to that date. It features some splendid actors, including Lee Van Cleef, Harry Dean Stanton, John Deal, and Kurt Russell, doing a very funny Eastwood imitation. With a great premise, decent money, and a good cast, where does Escape from New York go wrong? Partially, I think it's because of the inadequate special effects, which were done at Roger Corman's cheapo studio in a Los Angeles lumberyard. If you study the credits closely, you'll see the name of one Jim Cameron, listed as effects photographer and matte artist. Could this be the renowned James Cameron of Terminator and the Abyss fame? Maybe it could if you recall how bad the model work and the matters were in Terminator 1. More to the point, though, is that the film obviously doesn't take place here in New York. For budgetary reasons, it was shot in St. Louis and Century City, Los Angeles, neither of which resemble Manhattan at all. And there's a certain laziness and sprawling quality to the script, which never really gets going, beyond the level of in-jokes, such as subsidiary characters named Romero and Cronenberg. Nevertheless, here it is.
Now on BBC Two, tonight's MovieDrome presentation, Manhunter, introduced by Alex Cox and based on the novel Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. It depicts the hunt for a brutal serial killer. The film contains strong language, and some viewers may find the subject matter disturbing.
you ever go out to the pictures, or even if you only watch television programs about the pictures, you can hardly fail to have heard about a film called Silence of the Lambs, directed by Jonathan Demme. It's the story of a hideous but charming serial murderer named Dr. Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins, and an FBI agent, played by Jodie Foster, who uses the incarcerated Lecter's homicidal instincts to track down another serial killer currently at large. What you may not have heard is that there is another film in which the mad former psychiatrist and bon vivant Lecter appears. It's called Manhunter, and it was directed by Michael Mann in 1986. Comparisons being invidious, let's make some. Jonathan Demme is a very good director who keeps improving. Michael Mann is the creator of Miami Vice and an incorrigible faddist. Demme's film is tightly plotted, Mann's is not. Demme's film has a real sense of place, and so does Mann's. Note the use of the High Museum Atlanta as the location for the high-security mental hospital where Lecter is kept. Manhunter is full of LA stereotypes, like the burned-out big-city cop who lives in a penthouse on the beach and keeps a Learjet waiting on the runway. He's more like a TV producer than a cop, in fact. Mann's hero is played by William Peterson, essentially reprising his role in To Live and Die in LA. Both films have their share of high technology and running, jumping, hiding, shooting cops in black SS outfits. Silence of the Lambs ends as Manhunter begins, seen through a set of high-tech, green-tinted video night vision goggles, symbol of psycho killers everywhere. Why then are we showing Manhunter? 3 reasons. One is that it's very similar to Silence of the Lambs and was made 4 years earlier. Both films are in fact based on books by the author, Thomas Harris. Second is Brian Cox, the outstanding Shakespearean actor who plays Dr. Lecter, the mad intellectual of whom we earlier spoke. Cox and Hopkins look the spitting image of each other. And isn't it interesting that when they need a literate psychopath in these movies, for example Lecter or Klaus von Bülow, they cast a heavyweight English actor? And a question. Why is it that in cop rock movies like this and To Live and Die in LA, all the characters stand with their heads permanently cocked to one side like this? Tonight's offering is a horror film directed by Henri-Georges Clouzot. It's called Les Diaboliques, and yes, it's in French with subtitles in English down at the bottom of the screen. But please don't turn off. Don't change channels and end up watching some alternative cult film MovieDrome probably rejected. Keep watching. You will not be disappointed. This film is at least 15 times more frightening than Friday the 12th Part 14 or any of the other inane sequels you can rent down at the newsagents. This is a real film, directed by a real film director, and it's really frightening. If you watch Diabolique all the way to the end, you will be scared, guaranteed. It's very unfortunate my having to throw myself at your feet like this and beg you to watch Diabolique, but there really does seem to be a lot of resistance to foreign language films, not only in this country but all over Europe. France and Britain are relatively civilized in showing foreign films in their original language, assuming they get shown at all. Germany, Italy, and Spain, on the other hand, will generally only screen dubbed foreign movies. And all across the EEC, the most popular films are the American ones, with local products coming a distant second and other nations' movies hardly registering at all. Welcome to 1992. Yet imagine a triple bill of Repulsion, Diabolique, and Paul Verhoeven's The Fourth Man. 3 fantastic, sexy Euro horror films. Pit them against the contemporary Hollywood product, say Pet Sematary, Freddy's Dead, and William Friedkin's The Guardian. Why would anybody want to watch films like these if they could watch films like those? Well, social justice notwithstanding, here is Diabolique.
I can't really tell you what it's all about since the plot is fraught with too many strange twists and surprises. Let me instead briefly mention the director, Henri-Georges Clouzot. Clouzot's second feature, Le Corbeau, was made in 1942 and produced by the German-owned Continental Films. The film's negative and depressing view of provincial France was seen as German propaganda, and as a result, Clouzot didn't direct again until 1947, when he made Quai des Orfèvres. Clouzot evolved into a cynical, highly pessimistic filmmaker, and also a very brilliant one. His most celebrated film is the adventure drama Wages of Fear, which was remade, not badly, by the aforementioned William Friedkin before his fall from high estate. Wages of Fear, the story of 4 men paid to truck high explosives through jungles and across mountains in Honduras, is one of the greatest films of all time. It was made entirely in the south of France. Diabolique has much of the same intensity and mad invention, though unlike Wages of Fear, it's about women, not men. It features implacable Simone Signoret and the fabulously beautiful Vera Clouzot, wife of the director. She was also the glamorously cringing love interest in Wages of Fear.
One of the problems of working for small, independent film companies is that sometimes the funding for their small, independent films runs out in the middle and the film is never finished. Or if it is finished, the company goes bust and never brings it out. One of the problems of working for big, rich studios is that the studio may lavish lots of money on big, ambitious, intellectually stimulating artistic films and then just not like the finished product and refuse to bring it out. This is what happened to Brazil. Brazil was made in 1984 by Terry Gilliam. It's the film that 1984 wasn't and should have been. It has all the atmosphere and the preoccupations of Orwell's book, plus references to heavy metal comics, Eisenstein, and Mad. Gilliam said, when asked where the story took place, somewhere on the Los Angeles-Belfast border. It was also inspired by his experiences of a police riot in Los Angeles and by a visit to Port Talbot in Wales. Gilliam began his career as a cartoonist, but made his reputation as the inventor of the cutout animation on Monty Python's Flying Circus. In '72, he co-directed Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the first and funniest of the Python films. He then made Jabberwocky, which we saw last MovieDrome season, if you recall, and Time Bandits, which was a big international hit. Gilliam, like Stanley Kubrick, is an American filmmaker who resides in Britain. He's a highly skilled visualist. Batman was shot by Roger Pratt, who photographed Brazil for Gilliam. It looks identical, only not as good. Gilliam is also a skillful director of actors. How can this be, in one who comes not from the theatre, but from the drawing board? Gilliam's answer, you just cast the movie right, and then the actors do the work. Gilliam's contract with the large and nameless studio said that the film had to be a maximum of 2 hours and 5 minutes long. When he submitted a cut that was 2 hours and 11 minutes long, the sensitive executives announced that they were going to re-edit the film, take out the nasty and the naughty bits, and release it at a length of 90 minutes. This happens all the time in Hollywood. The same fate befell The Magnificent Ambersons, A Star is Born, Naked City, Red Badge of Courage, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and most of Sam Peckinpah's films. The same studio, when it couldn't figure out how to re-edit a film, would simply sit on it. This happened with Two Lane Blacktop, The Last Movie, and Rumblefish. Brazil didn't get a wide release in the USA, but Gilliam did manage to prevent them from re-editing his film. By going to war with the studio in the pages of Variety, Gilliam made the executives look stupid and won a Los Angeles Critics Award for himself and for his film. He called Brazil Part 2 of a trilogy about the ages of man and the subordination of magic to realism, Part 1 being Time Bandits and Part 3 Baron Munchausen. The studio executives called Brazil interminable to sit through and unreleasable. Here are all 12,842 fantastic feat, Brazil.
Something truly horrible for you.
The Baby was directed in 1972 by Ted Post. Ted Post is probably not a name that most people conjure with, yet for me he was one of the best American directors for hire, having made a very passable spaghetti western imitation with Clint Eastwood, Hang 'em High, and perhaps also the best of the Dirty Harry films, certainly the best of the Dirty Harry sequels, Magnum Force. Most film and TV directors are directors for hire, in fact, in the sense that they don't initiate their own projects, but direct whatever comes along. A good American example would be Gordon Douglas, who did fine work on movies as diverse as Vaquero and Them. On our side of the Atlantic, Mike Hodges springs to mind. He directed Get Carter, Flash Gordon, and Morons from Outer Space. Some directors start out for hire and become auteurs, Don Siegel being the obvious example. Others start out auteurs and do the reverse. William Friedkin, for instance, who, after making Sorcerer, one of the most expensive personal projects of all time, was reduced to doing Chevy Chase vehicles and rip-offs of his own The Exorcist, like The Guardian. Even highly respected American directors hire themselves out on worthless projects from time to time. Coppola on Peggy Sue Got Married, Scorsese on The Color of Money, in the hope of getting bucks for personal projects down the line. Tonight, Ted Post takes us on a weird 60s excursion which resembles a cross between Play Misty for Me and The Beguiled. Like The Beguiled or Aldrich's Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, The Baby is all about women, obsessive, oppressive harridans, or predatory innocents who look and sound a lot like characters from an R. Crumb cartoon or from a Corman Edgar Allan Poe movie. The heroine appears to live in the House of Usher, too. The dialogue, by Abraham Polsky, who also co-produced the film with another Polsky, Milton, is sensational. Though made in '72, The Baby is pure hippiana. Do you like physical exercise? I'm a Scorpio. We're very cautious. Which occasionally rises to the sublimely manic heights of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. When you're a winner, Alba, the possibility of losing doesn't exist. Ruth Roman is excellent as Mrs. Wordsworth, a mad combo of Joan Collins, Elizabeth Taylor, and Joan Crawford. And Anna Jetcoma is a more than able foil.
I didn't mean any harm, Mrs. Wadsworth. I just want to help Baby reach his full potential.
Are you sure that's all you want, Mrs. Gentry?
What more could there be?
The Baby does descend into the familiar girls creeping through the darkened corridors of the old Dark House mode in the last reel, but it redeems itself completely in its final minutes with the most outstandingly sick ending of any film yet shown on MovieDrome.
Face to Face is one of 3 political westerns by the Italian director Sergio Sollima, who sometimes operates under the pseudonym of Sterling Simon. The other 2 films were The Big Gun Down, an excellent bounty hunter movie starring Lee Van Cleef and Thomas Milian, and Run Man Run, a rather worse than mediocre sequel involving the further adventures of Milian. They were political in much the same way as all the spaghetti westerns, setting up a rural-urban conflict in which the city dwellers are always insidious degenerates or usurious bankers, and the rural characters innocent exploitees, often championed by a glamorous social bandit. It's a straightforward, simple-minded view that you can find even in supposedly sophisticated Italian films, the most lumbering example perhaps being 1900.
Face to Face, which was made in 1967, has been described as a parable of the rise of European fascism. Well, maybe. It certainly has the political schematic outlined above, but to me it seems more a Borgesian tale of fate and doppelgangers. You can take your pick. It also has, and this is where it gets good, some of the most improbable character names and some of the most outlandish haircuts ever seen in a Western. Gian Maria Volonte plays Professor Brad Fletcher, a consumptive Boston University teacher who heads west for his health. Volonte is, of course, one of the great spaghetti Western actors. He was the bandit chief in Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More, and he was the unwilling revolutionary in A Bullet for the General. Volonte was a serious actor who'd been blacklisted for being a communist. Leone was the first director to break ranks and give him a job. Later, he went on to appear in more serious political films, including Sacco and Vanzetti and Francesco Rossi's Lucky Luciano. He's always good, and this is one of his better Western roles. In Face to Face, Brad Fletcher becomes involved with a Mexican bandit with the unlikely moniker of Solomon Beauregard Bennett, leader of a hippie-esque outlaw gang called Bennett's Raiders. Beauregard is played by Tomas Milian, the Cuban actor who appeared in Solima's other political westerns and in many other spaghettis, including the truly extraordinary Django Kill. Milian, like Volonte, is a proper actor. He played the priest in Dennis Hopper's Peruvian epic, The Last Movie, and recently was seen as one of the anti-Castro hitmen in Oliver Stone's JFK. The chemistry between Volonte and Milian is really interesting, and it keeps the film alive when it might otherwise expire, as for instance in the incongruous hippie commune scenes. There are also those haircuts to contend with. But Face to Face is really quite an entertaining and intriguing film. Watch out for several spaghetti western regulars, including William Berger as the mysterious Charlie Siringo, Aldo Sambrell as the treacherous polecat Zachary Schott, and Angel del Pozo in the role of the gentleman gunfighter Maximilian de Winton. For the discerning enthusiast, we proffer the new MovieDrome Guide. You can find out how to order your copy at the end of tonight's film.
I've an announcement.
Now on BBC Two we begin a new weekly series called MovieDrome.
Alex Cox, and welcome to the MovieDrome, a season of cult films. What is a cult film? A cult film is one which has a passionate following but does not appeal to everybody. James Bond movies are not cult films, but chainsaw movies are. Just because a movie is a cult movie does not automatically guarantee quality. Some cult movies are very bad, others are very, very good. Some make an awful lot of money at the box office, others make no money at all. Some are considered quality films, others are exploitation. One thing they do have in common is that they're all genre films. That's to say, a French word meaning the type or category of film in question, for example, gangster films or westerns. Cult films also have a tendency to slosh over from one genre into another, so that a science fiction film might become a detective movie, or vice versa. They're also generally cheaply made. Most of the films in this season cost under $2 million. Some of them cost a great deal less. They share common themes as well, themes which I would suggest are the common themes of all drama: love, murder, and greed. Murder and greed predominate in this season. Tonight's film is called The Wicker Man. It was written by Anthony Shaffer, who's the author of Sleuth. Cinefantastique magazine called it, rather optimistically, the Citizen Kane of horror films. It was directed by Robin Hardy, a British director who formerly specialized in television commercials. It has a cult reputation, although most of the people who
rate it very highly as a cult. As far as I'm aware, haven't seen it, at least not in its original version. It was originally 102 minutes long, but the owner of the film decided that it would be much better if they cut 15 minutes out and put it on the second half of a double bill. This was back in the days when you went to the pictures, you used to get 2 films for the price of 1. So they cut it down to 87 minutes, and in 1973 released it on a double bill with Don't Look Now. As the years went by and the film's cult reputation grew, attempts were made to restore the missing portions. But attempts to find the original negative were frustrated. Apparently the negative ended up in the pylons that support the M4 motorway. The version that we're going to show tonight contains a number of the original scenes that were thought to have been lost. However, there's one principal scene still missing. It's an early sequence in which Edward Woodward, who plays a Scottish police officer, is introduced, and we're told he's engaged to be married and he has not yet known a woman. So bear that in mind as you enjoy the pagan delights of the Wicker Man, which include Lindsay Kemp, the mime artist, Christopher Lee, without his cape, and Britt Ekland, dubbed in Scottish.
MovieDrome, as you may know, is supposed to be a forum for cult films. With this in mind, we've shown the work of cult directors like Robert Aldrich, Don Siegel, John Waters, and Roger Corman. And we've screened some genuinely hard-to-find cultist rarities, including Honeymoon Killers and Carnival of Souls. Because films of this nature don't necessarily attract the biggest audience, and Nick Jones, the producer and director of the series and the man who picks these movies, is under an obligation to the corporation to attract some viewers now and then, at times we have departed from our brief in order to show commercial as hell super blockbusters such as Terminator. Tonight, Nick and I both wish to atone for such incorrect behavior by screening a cult movie par excellence, a 200% cult classic, Frank Zappa's 200 Motels. You must remember 200 Motels. It was always playing at midnight on Saturday at the Scala back when you were protesting against the Vietnam War and listening to Atom Heart Mother. That's right, it's that film. Probably you saw the advert in the paper or on the marquee, and equally probably you didn't go and see it. Now you can. 200 Motels was directed by Frank Zappa and Tony Palmer in 1971. Tony Palmer was a British television director who also made musical biopics, including one in which Sir Richard Burton played Wagner. Frank Zappa was, as you're probably aware, the leader of a famous band from the 60s and 70s called the Mothers of Invention. 200 Motels is a rockumentary, precursor to Spinal Tap and contemporaneous to The Monkey's Head. Unlike, say, early Beatles movies where there was some attempt to find a plot, the disappearance of Paul's granddad, for instance, 200 Motels has no plot and consists of concert footage and comedic sketches of a Rowan and Martin's laugh-in nature, naturally featuring members of the band. There is also some animation of a sub-Gilliam variety. The movie was shot on video and later transferred to film. There's actually some very funny stuff, much of it centering around the character of Jimmy Carl Black, who at one point remarks, "Just as long as I get some beer and get paid, I'll do anything. I'm professional." It's interesting to note that 200 Motels was made in Britain at Pinewood Studios. This was the time when American studios were actually coming to England to do productions because it was so much cheaper. Now European production costs have driven the Americans, and in many cases the Europeans mismos, back to the United States. Apparently Frank Zappa conceived 200 Motels as a musical work to be performed live in concert. He attempted to have the London Philharmonic Orchestra play it, but venue officials declared the libretto obscene and refused to allow it to be performed. Undaunted, Zappa turned the magnum opus into a film, incorporating footage of the Mothers of Invention shot over the previous 5 years. The results follow, among them Keith Moon as a nun, Ringo Starr on the final solution to the orchestra question, and Jimmy Carl's immortal Lonesome Cowboy Burt. Oh, and the monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey. I wonder what you'll make of it. Frank Zappa is by any standards an extraordinary man.
In addition to this film and records too numerous to mention, he owns a mail order business, Barfco Swill, which turns over $1 million a year. He once described himself as never a hippie, always a freak, but never a hippie. In politics, he sees himself as a traditional conservative, although he views politics not as a matter of left-wing and right-wing, but rather of fascism versus freedom. As a pragmatist, he is a registered Democrat, but says he might prefer to vote Republican if you were to extract the evil influence of the religious right from the Republican Party.
Was brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe.
Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jubjub bird, and shun the frumious Bandersnatch.
He took his vorpal sword in hand. Long time the manxome foe he sought. Then rested he by the tum-tum tree, and stood a while in thought. And, as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock, with eyes of flame, came whiffling through the tulgey wood, and burbled as it came. Snick, snack, snicker-snack, the vorpal blade went through and back. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back.
And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. No frabjous day, Callooh, Calais.
He chortled in his joy.
'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe.
All mimsy were the borogoves.
Here's Alex Cox.
Invasion of the Body Snatchers is that rare thing, a remake that is as good as the original film. There have been countless lousy and incompetent remakes, Stagecoach for instance, or Father of the Bride. Sometimes they are so bad they have to be concealed under a different title. The remake of Out of the Past was called Against All Odds. Offhand, I can think of only one other instance in which a genuinely good remake was made, and that was William Friedkin's Wages of Fear, a truly inspired retelling of the French classic. Wages of Fear was a great film based on a great film. It was also a monumental failure at the box office. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is a good film based on a good film. Needless to say, it made lots of money and made its director Philip Kaufman that equally rare thing, an independent American filmmaker whom the studios considered bankable. From humble and intelligent beginnings like the great Northfield, Minnesota raid, he went on to achieve grandiloquence in the form of The Right Stuff and the unbearable lightness of Daniel Day-Lewis. The original version of the Invasion of the Body Snatchers has been shown on MovieDrome, as the gentle viewer will no doubt recall. Made in 1955, it was a dark and moody science fiction thriller, a bit intellectual and a tad more subtle than the radioactive cloud that turns men into giant ants, 50s norm. Directed by Don Siegel, it was a parable of the encroachment of a dangerous alien conformity upon a small California town. At the time, the great manufactured paranoia was communism, and the film could be viewed as a warning against said political doctrine, or as a criticism of those who would suppress it at all costs. Communism remained the great American fear through 6 presidencies, justifying the enormous military expenditures of the Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford years. By 1978, Carter was president, and the Red Menace didn't seem such a menace anymore. In fact, for a brief while, it began to appear that the menace might actually be domestic rather than foreign, hence the very different take of Philip Kaufman's film. Instead of a small town in Northern California, we're in San Francisco, a city filled with already threatening people and job descriptions. Long before the aliens show up in force, it's obvious that something's wrong. The post-Vietnam, post-Watergate fear of big, unseen power politics lurks at the edges of the film. One of the symbols of lurking corporate encroachment in this version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers is this odd-looking skyscraper, a little like a stretched-out version of the Masonic pyramid on the dollar bill. It appears several times and always manages to aggravate our sense of unease. Ironically, or maybe not, this building is called the Transamerica Tower, Transamerica being a massive corporation that owned, among other assets, United Artists, the producer of this film. Watch out for Don Siegel, playing a small role as a taxi driver, and Kevin McCarthy, star of the previous Body Snatchers, reprising one of the scenes from the original film. Also be on the lookout for a 5-second appearance from Robert Duvall, whose part is so small he doesn't receive a credit, and Leonard Nimoy in a non-pointy-eared role. Grateful Dead fans should prepare to enjoy Jerry Garcia on the banjo.
Here on 2, tonight's film in the MovieDrome is Ken Russell's controversial account of the composer Tchaikovsky's tempestuous sexual and emotional life, introduced by Alex Cox.
Ken Russell is, according to the conventional wisdom, the baddest boy of British cinema. It's fashionable among the critical and producerial elite to deride our Ken and treat him as a finished madman from a bygone age. This in spite of the fact that in just the last 2 or 3 years he's made at least 4 feature films. And in spite of the fact that any video shop you go into is bound to be a veritable trove of Russell films. The list of his important films is extremely long. The Devils, Tommy, Savage Messiah, Women in Love, The Boyfriend, Valentino, even his bad films, principally Altered States, have some very interesting stuff in them. And his recent work, in Salome's Last Dance and The Lair of the White Worm, shows no significant dimming of Russell's creative flair. It's not hard to say why Russell's pictures tend to goad the critics and the intelligentsia. For a start, he himself is a noted critic basher, having accosted a notable critic on live TV. In addition, he's somewhat self-indulgent. No recent Russell film can be complete without a fantasy sequence featuring crucified sheep and writhing naked nuns. But his worst crime, maybe, is that no matter how elevated his subject matter, his approach to it is always resolutely anti-intellectual. There is nothing Russell likes more than broad humor and hosts of people drinking and taking off their clothes. Tonight's film, The Music Lovers, is the life story of Tchaikovsky. Russell is very fond of biopics about composers and other artists. His early work for the BBC included dramatic biographies of Richard Strauss and Frederick Delius. Imagine how The Music Lovers would have been if, for example, David Putnam had made it. Long, reverential credit sequence, black screen. Credits go on and on. Music builds. More credits. Cut to a fabulous country house in the Ukraine. Cut to 100 extras toiling in the fields. Cut to a butler pouring a glass of vodka. Cut to a shot of sunlight streaming through parted curtains onto a man at the piano. Music builds, and so on for the next 3.5 hours. We're talking Oscar material. Our Ken will have none of this. His Tchaikovsky is a gay man married to a nymphomaniac, with a bit of music on the side. A lot of music, actually. It's great. It's really funny. Has a screenplay by South Bank Supremo Melvin Bragg. Great performances, particularly from Glenda Jackson as Mrs. Tchaikovsky, and from Richard Chamberlain, who appears to be really playing the piano in the concert scenes. I think it's this determination not to make a well-made film, but rather to make an entertaining madcap film which really catches your attention that annoys the critics so. Your cultural elite like to believe that fellas like Tchaikovsky and Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov are their property. What Russell does is to attempt to make highbrow stuff less posh, less exclusive. Sometimes he fails, as in his Nightmare on Elm Street version of the Byron Shelley story, Gothic. But more often he succeeds, as in Salome's Last Dance or in The Devils. If you haven't seen The Devils, you should try and get a copy on tape. They don't make films like it anymore, and it isn't going to show up on TV uncut anytime in the next 5,000 years. But for tonight, The Music Lovers. Set in Russia in the 1870s, shot in England in the 1970s, a biggish budget British film with balls.
The silver screen on the small screen now on BBC Two, with Alex Cox as a supporting feature just before a MovieDrome double bill.
Tonight, MovieDrome presents Excalibur, the story of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Known during development and pre-production by a variety of titles, including Merlin, Merlin Lives, and Knights, it's held together partially by the character of Merlin the Magician, portrayed by Nicole Williamson in a silver skull cap. The monthly film bulletin was scathing about Williamson, calling his performance abysmal, but I don't really agree. He has a difficult job holding together a vast array of unrelated and sometimes incomprehensible elements, and I think he does it well. Apparently, Excalibur was conceived by director John Borman as an alternative to his long-planned but never executed version of Lord of the Rings. The bulletin is an interesting take on this long rambling project, observing that there is such a thing as too personal a project, an idea turned over for so long that its individuality gets trapped inside it, the consensus filmmaking dreamt of by Hollywood committees. Whoa! Well, it certainly is as unfocused as a lot of Hollywood committee movies, as Borman struggles to incorporate a lot of history and legend and poetic sources into an epic tale with no particular central character. But among the long proceedings there is much good as well as bad. The cast is great. Helen Mirren is a splendid Morgana, and the Knights are a veritable who's who of future movie stars. Liam Neeson is Sir Gawain, Gabriel Byrne is Uther Pendragon, and Patrick Stewart, Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Starship Enterprise, is Léon Degrance. The special optical effects are by veteran effectsman Wally Vivers, and the special photography is by Oxford Scientific Films. The production design by Anthony Pratt is sometimes predictable, but sometimes fascinating, as when the Knights ride into a medieval settlement and discover a hell's mouth, wonderful period detail, in the form of a stage on which depictions of hell and other religious torments were portrayed by actors, the predecessor of theatre and film. My problem with Excalibur is that it's so legendary, it's sometimes hard to care what's going on. Will Sir Bucket find the Holy Grail, or will he fall into the fiery pit? Well, it's only interesting if I know who Sir Bucket is. Is he a minor league knight or a major player? How many chattels does he have? How many vassals? How many serfs toil in his fields? And what sort of toiling do they do? Do they produce anything, or merely grovel in mud, as in Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Now that film was full of serfs, and so the film was grounded, or mudded. In this film you rarely see a commoner. It's all so long ago, enshrouded in the mists of necromancy, that it's a tad difficult to relate to. Of course, the director, screenwriter, producer might reply, it's not reality, it's myth, it's legend, and he'd have a very good point. Although, if it is meant to exist on a mythic, not mundane level, shouldn't it be a bit bigger, a bit more magical? Note the fine beginning, for example, with its red sky and horses apparently breathing fire. Well, Kurosawa would have cut to the big night shot with 1,000 men with flaming torches running down the hill. Excalibur is anything but a cheap film, but Borman keeps almost everything in medium shot. The search for the Grail, if this is myth or legend, could take us to the Gobi or Sahara Desert, even to the rainforests of Mexico or Brazil. But no, all these Knoble knights do is ride around the damper parts of Ireland in the mist. Mustn't grumble, though. Whatever the film's virtues and faults, it was a tremendous achievement of the director-producer, getting many $1 million out of Columbia Pictures, Warner Brothers and Orion to make a film about a British subject with no American actors at all. This was back in the mist-enshrouded days of 1981, of course. Such a mythic quest might not be as attainable today.
Good evening, and welcome to the 5th season of MovieDrome. You see, there really is no shortage of weird and interesting cult-type films, in spite of the abysmal dreck which passes for entertainment in the contemporary cinema. In keeping with our traditional policy of only presenting the most positive and uplifting visions of the Dream Factory, we have 3 pictures depicting Hollywood as hell: Day of the Locust, Inserts, and Robert Aldrich's The Big Knife. Aldrich remains the most prolific MovieDrome director, but he receives strong competition this year from Canada's own David Cronenberg. We're presenting the TV premieres of Dead Ringers and the depraved Rabid, perhaps Mr. Cronenberg's most horrible and brilliant film. We have directorial offerings from Orson Welles, Larry Cohen, Clint Eastwood, Stanley Kubrick, and Henri-Georges Clouzot, and sterling performances by Dennis Hopper, Vincent Price, Ed Harris, Ida Lupino, Bob Hoskins, Shelley Winters, Peter Sellers, and Marilyn Chambers. We have a giant alligator in the New York sewer system, and a pterodactyl in the Chrysler building. Several ingenious murder plots, and a befuddled university professor infatuated with a teenage nymphette. We even have a non-violent Peckinpah film, to say nothing of no less than 2 movies with the word serpent in the title. How can the discerning cinephile resist? Our first film tonight is one of the last gasps of the once proud Australian cinema, Mad Max 2. Mad Max 1, you may recall, was a low-budget science fiction action thriller which introduced Mel Gibson to the agog world. Mad Max 2 is that rare thing, a sequel which is actually better than the original. The only other instance I can think of is For a Few Dollars More, the sequel to A Fistful of Dollars. Interestingly, in both cases, the director remained the same. Leone, of course, went on to make an even better sequel, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The second Mad Max sequel, Beyond Thunderdome, was by all accounts not of the same caliber, despite the presence of the noted actress Tina Turner and Mr. Gibson yet again. Mad Max 2, released in the US as The Road Warrior, is a tremendous action film. Benefiting from a bigger budget than Mad Max 1, it also lacks its predecessor's desultory borrowings and pretentiousness. It still borrows extensively from road movies, spaghetti westerns, punk fashion, and John Ford cavalry films, but in a very clever and entertaining way. The director was George Miller, and for my money, it's his best film. But what's best for the discerning viewer isn't always what's best for our favorite planet. And Mad Max 2 really should have been forced to file an environmental impact report before beginning shooting. What with all the burning tires, blazing diesel fuel, wasted petrol, and the inevitable mounds of styrofoam cups and flattened beer cans dumped in the desert, Mad Max 2 and all of its ilk of action films stands as a major ecological menace. As do all motion pictures, when you consider the volume of toxic chemicals produced by the processing laboratory and ultimately dumped into the groundwater and the sewage system of the unhappy city where the film is edited. Films are a petrochemical process and a waste-intensive industry. And if this relatively humble offering is bad, what about a 30 or a 40 million buck explodorama such as Die Hard 3 or Terminator 9? Can you imagine the amount of pollution generated by Arnold Schwarzenegger's camper or Mel Gibson's Learjet? Ultimately, of course, this tirade means nothing. Film's a big business, like napalm manufacture or the second-generation Concorde. But to reduce waste in the entire entertainment business, don't watch big-budget Hollywood movies, which are disproportionately idiotic in their excess. Don't ever watch commercials or rock videos for the same reason, and stay tuned to MovieDrome, home of the lower-budget, marginally ecologically sounder films. Yay!
Tonight's film, Rope, is a famous thriller by the director of so many famous thrillers, Alfred Hitchcock. In 7 years, this is the first Hitchcock film we've shown on MovieDrome, and there's a reason for that. While MovieDrome, in theory, is a selection of cult and weirdo-type movies, Hitchcock is the epitome of the commercial director. His films were designed to be seen by the largest of mass audiences in the United States, Europe, and all over the world. Of all Hitchcock films, perhaps only Psycho and The Birds, odd, uncharacteristic movies made late in his career, could be described as cult movies. Why then are we showing Rope? Because, in addition to being a celebrated thriller, Rope is also famous as a cinematic experiment, an attempt to give the illusion that the film was made in one continuous shot.
I've always wished for more artistic talent. Well, murder can be an art too. The power to kill can be just as satisfying as the power to create.
In fact, the fame of Rope is slightly exaggerated. There are at least 2 exchanges of close-ups at crucial moments in the film, and an opening exterior. But the rest of the film is played as if it were one continuous shot, uninterrupted by close-ups, medium shots, or masters. At the time, the average film had anything up to 600 separate cuts in it. Today, with the fast editing popularized by television programs and MTV videos, the cuts can number in the thousands. And there's nothing inherently wrong in that. A film can exist any way the filmmaker wants it to. And some filmmakers, as diverse as Bruce Conner and Nicholas Roeg, have produced fascinating films whose excellence was in the editing. At the same time, editing strategies, especially the modern exchanges of televisual close-ups, can become predictable. The long take, if done well, cannot. Remember the extraordinary opening shot of Touch of Evil. Would that sequence be remembered today if it had been accomplished by 30 shots instead of 1? In Rope, Hitchcock goes one better than any other exponent of the long take, fashioning a film which appears to be one continuous sequence. Obviously it can't be. A roll of 35mm film is at the maximum 1,000 feet long, approximately 10 minutes. Hence, every 10 minutes, Hitchcock and his cameraman Joseph Valentine were forced to find a solution to the problem of the reel change. And they often joined reels by having a character walk past the camera, momentarily blacking out the frame. If Rope, the story of 2 dispassionate young killers based on the Leopold and Loeb murder case, resembles theatre, it's not surprising. It's based on a play by the British novelist and playwright Patrick Hamilton. His work has recently been rediscovered. Rope was revived this year in London. The entire film was shot on a soundstage, in a set specially constructed with flying walls and furniture which moved on especially greased rollers. A special dolly was invented by the key grip Maurice Rosen to allow the bulky studio camera greater freedom of movement. As many as 5 microphone boom operators were working simultaneously to record live sound. To complicate matters still further, it was Hitchcock's first color film, and they had great problems creating the right effect of evening light towards the end of the film. When cameraman Valentine left the picture due to illness, Hitchcock reshot the final 5 reels. In spite of its theatrical origins, Rope is far from stagey. Able to act out entire sequences, sometimes 10 minutes in length, the actors are able to deliver performances as opposed to snippets. James Stewart as the suspicious professor, and John Dahl and Farley Granger as the killers are outstanding.
Take it easy, Philip. Rupert's onto something. He isn't. Now let up. Got to have a drink, Brandon. Enough. You're not. Take your hand off my arm. Don't you ever again tell me what to do and what not to do. I don't like it, Brandon, and I'm not going to take it. Voice down. I hope I didn't upset Philip.
You never let me put so
No, he's more likely mixing his drinks.
You seem rather upset yourself.
Do I?
Special praise is due the model-making section of the art department, who produced a giant perspective model of the New York skyline outside the apartment windows. Including replicas of the Empire State and Chrysler Building, the skyline contained 6,000 flashing lights, 200 miniature neon signs, 26,000 feet of wire, and was operated by 47 different switches. The said model also included cloud formations made from spun glass and chicken wire under the direction of the famous meteorologist, Dr. Dinsmore Alter. Rehearsals for Rope took 10 days. Filming began on January 22nd, 1948, and ended on February 21st, 4 weeks later. Because it was based on an actual event, Rope was a cause of anxiety in certain parts of the United States. It was banned in Chicago, where the crime occurred, and also in Spokane, Memphis, and Seattle.
Well, now on BBC Two, a welcome back to Alex Cox to introduce a new season of cult films in MovieDrome.
Good evening, and welcome to the 4th season of MovieDrome. This year's selection of cult and obscure ephemera will take us from Finland to Lawrence, Kansas, and from Notting Hill Gate to Cape Fear. Most MovieDrome movies aren't big hits in Hollywood, either with cinemagoers or the studios that finance them. In fact, if there's a typical MovieDrome film, it was probably financed by a major studio which fired the director halfway through and then pulled out entirely, leaving the cast to pool their savings and finish the film in another country under the directorship of a generous used car dealer. Don't be surprised if many of the films we show were made by the likes of Joseph Losey, Terrence Malick, Richard Rush and Orson Welles, all of whom were given the old heave-ho by the conventional movie scene. Likewise, don't be surprised to find them making films about tormented artists, to wit, this season's biopics of Mishima, Tchaikovsky, and Lenny Bruce. If you love big, glossy Hollywood productions starring Robin Williams and Steve Martin, Robert Redford and Meryl Streep, stop watching. Turn off now, be warned. The drone may prove damaging to your taste. But if you actually like films that were shot in abandoned fun fairs in Lawrence, Kansas, or in the bowels of Russian rocket launching tubes, stay tuned. Clint Eastwood made 3 films with the Italian director Sergio Leone and 5 with the American Don Siegel. He parted company with Leone in '66 and with Siegel in the '70s, and since then has been pretty much his own director. Though he usually bequeaths the director's seat to someone else, he hangs onto the reins, so to speak, producing all the films in which he appears. Certain movies for certain reasons he directs himself, and most of those show substantial debits to Don Siegel and Sergio Leone. Leone and Siegel were top-of-the-line action directors in their respective countries. Leone collaborated with Robert Aldrich on Sodom and Gomorrah and directed Eastwood in 3 millennial spaghetti westerns. Siegel, who had begun life as an editor, graduated to top-flight B-movies such as Riot in Cell Block 11 and The Killers. Siegel and Eastwood made Coogan's Bluff in 1968. It's an effective film about an Arizona sheriff who comes to New York to catch a bad man. It was his first film without a horse or a mule. In 1970, they both made 2 Mules for Sister Sarah, a dismal imitation spaghetti western co-starring Shirley MacLaine. Eastwood appeared in several imitation Italian westerns, actually, including Ted Post's lively Hang 'em High and Joe Kidd, a wretched rip-off of The Big Silence, which we saw on MovieDrome last year. In 1971, Eastwood and Don Siegel made the majorly successful Dirty Harry, and in 1979 they did Escape from Alcatraz. But in between, Eastwood and Siegel found time to make another film, one that's extremely weird and uncharacteristic of them, and that's the film we're going to see tonight. It's another western, set in the Civil War, and called The Beguiled. The Beguiled is unlike anything else that Siegel did. For a start, it's mostly about women. Eastwood is the only male character in the film. Nor is it a conventional cowboy film. There are no cowboys. Instead of his usual heroic self, Eastwood plays a deserter from the Union Army, wounded but game for whatever's going on in a weird Gothic house full of obsessive Confederate spinsters who decide to keep him. It's a cross between a Jacobean tragedy and Ambrose Bierce, which is not very far apart at all. Bierce was a Civil War scout who later became a cynical journalist and vanished in Mexico looking for Pancho Villa. He wrote about a dozen short stories set during the Civil War, which are just extraordinary, really vivid and grim and beautifully written. Bierce's Victorians, or pre-Victorians, are very modern in their evil banality. So are the villains of Jacobean tragedies, although a tad more flamboyant. And the characters in The Beguiled? Well, they're sort of 60s-ish. In fact, The Beguiled comes from that happy time when it was possible to experiment with cinema, to play with film language, with multi-exposures and dream sequences, the era of Midnight Cowboy and The Last Movie. Today, when the American film industry makes a film about the Civil War, they fill it with lies about honor and nobility and the privilege of being gunned down carrying the flag, and call it glory. Wilfred Owen would not approve, but Bierce would be amused.
Alex Cox and the team are going out tonight with a bang. It was the 70s thinking man's horror movie that drew a new benchmark.
Slow-motion, naked schoolgirl shower fantasy you are about to see is one of the distinctive hallmarks of the cinema of Brian De Palma, director of Wotan's Wake, Get to Know Your Rabbit, Phantom of the Paradise, Scarface, The Untouchables, and various other films. De Palma is often described by film critics as the heir to Hitchcock, but though he may share certain misogynistic traits in common with the master, the films which are mostly referred to as Hitchcockian, Body Double, Dress to Kill, and Blowout, seem to be ripped off not so much from Hitchcock as from Dario Argento. Argento, as you may recall, is the Italian director of such films as Four Flies on Grey Velvet, Suspiria, Opera, and the recent Trauma. Most of his films are so extremely horrible that they're not showable on television. I'm serious here. I honestly don't think that Argento's films should be seen by the accidental push of a remote control button. You have to want to see them, which many people do, just as many people want to go and see Pink Flamingos or Peter Greenaway marathons. En passant, it does seem odd to me that the British Board of Film Censors allows Dario Argento films to be shown but still won't give a certificate to Monty Hellman's Cockfighter, one of the very best American films of the 70s. By what standard are we not allowed to witness cockfights legally staged in the United States, yet we are permitted to watch the violent disemboweling of women in Argento's films or De Palma's Body Double? I suppose the answer would be that one is offensive to animal lovers and the other is entertainment. And Argento and De Palma are good filmmakers, there's no doubt about it. One Argento film we might conceivably show is his first movie, Bird with Crystal Plumage. It's a good thriller with a great soundtrack by Ennio Morricone. Check out the music of Crystal Plumage and the soundtrack of Body Double. They are at some points very similar. De Palma, of course, actually began to use Morricone as his composer on his more recent films. Anyway, per tonight's film Carrie. This was De Palma's first big hit. He made it in '76, a couple of years after his cult successes Sisters and Phantom of the Paradise. His films are marked by a considerable degree of black humor and are sometimes framed as nightmares or dreams. There are often paroxysms of violence. In The Fury, John Cassavetes explodes repeatedly from different camera angles, which De Palma states is his incorporation of Eisenstein's theory of montage as conflict. Film is violence, he has been quoted as saying. Carrie was the first film in which the name of Stephen King appeared. It's based on his novel. Today, of course, it's impossible to see a horror film which doesn't bear the moniker of Stephen King, except for Lawnmower Man, whose producers King sued to force them to take his highly valuable nomenclature off the poster. Not sure why. Speculation is that the film wasn't up to the normal artistic standard of your regular Stephen King film. Well, there have actually been some good Stephen King films, among them Cujo and the multi-part Creepshow. For my money, Carrie is the best of them all. The script is good, there's great performances from Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie, De Palma directs with abandon, and it provides an early example of the trick ending, staple of all horror films thereafter, often used to set up the endless round of sequels, as with Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th. Do not reveal the ending to your friends. For the discerning enthusiast, we proffer the new MovieDrome guide for £3 and a limited number of the original guide at a special price of £5 for the two. Copies are available by sending a check or postal order made out to BSS, to MovieDrome, P.O. Box 7, London W3 6XJ.
Welcome to the 6th season of MovieDrome. This year we proudly offer a selection which includes several insane westerns, a clutch of prison escape dramas,
Welcome to Alcatraz.
and the British premiere of no less than 4 cult features never before publicly screened on these shores.
Go faster! Go!
I'm so sick of people trying to run my life, you know? Babe brought this, babe brought that. What's
What's my name? You dumb ass, it's Big Brother. My name is Sam. Samuel. Sit down. What is it? I can't understand.
For the discerning enthusiast, we also proffer the new MovieDrome guide for a mere £3 and a limited number of the original old MovieDrome guide at a bonus price of £5 for the two. Buy both and save £1. Copies of these heirloom quality publications, which future generations of cave dwellers will undoubtedly be mystified by, are available by sending a check or postal order made out to BSS to MovieDrome, P.O. Box 7, London, W36XJ. Tonight, a film by Sam Raimi, director of The Evil Dead. You probably recall the controversy surrounding Raimi's low-budget 1980 horror picture. In the cold light of day, it's hard to see what all the posturing was about. Evil Dead was a good, competent, cabin-in-the-woods horror flick. Certainly not a cause célèbre worthy of all the anguish and outrage that surrounded its release on video. Raimi's bigger-budget crime wave, made in 1985, was considerably less successful, but Evil Dead 2 was a tremendous film, full of all sorts of manic originality. Manic originality is less in evidence when we witness Sam Raimi's first studio picture, Darkman. Made in 1990, Darkman was obviously intended to be a sequel procreator along the lines of Batman. The music for both films was composed by Danny Elfman. However, it didn't work out that way. Darkman lacks the well-developed comic book roots of Batman or Dick Tracy, and spends rather too much time referring to the Phantom of the Opera or indulging in familiar grotesquerie. Definitely a case of too many writers, with no less than 5 names credited with the screenplay. Nevertheless, blessed with a massive budget, Raimi does come up with some impressive action scenes, though seemingly the picture was taken away from him by the beneficent studio during editing. Directors for hire, John Landis and William Deere, have tiny acting roles, as do several hack producers from the studio. What, they couldn't find any actors in Los Angeles? Raimi's most recent film is Army of Darkness, a sort of sequel to Evil Dead 2, which takes place where the previous film dumped its protagonist, the Dark Ages. One rather distasteful thing about Darkman is its use of the common American movie cliché, the disposable black man. I had a girlfriend who worked for one of the major studios in Burbank, California, and she and the other secretaries were allowed to see the new studio product every week, and they used to take bets among themselves as to what reel the black character would die in. No kidding. This was a few years ago, but nothing has changed, to judge from Clint Eastwood's unsavory use of Morgan Freeman in Unforgiven. For a while, it seemed like every action movie coming out of Hollywood had a white hero with a black best friend who died somewhere between reels 2 and 8 in order to supply the hero with a convenient revenge motive. Now, we don't go to see those Hollywood pictures much, but a couple of years ago I made the mistake of seeing Darkman and David Lynch's Wild at Heart in a single weekend. At the start of Wild at Heart, the white hero beats a black guy till his brains run from his head. In Darkman, Raimi establishes the villain's villainy by having him cut off a black man's fingers with a cigar cutter. Coincidence? Or something else? Well, I don't know. And I expect that sort of thudding, mindless racism from thudding, mindless blockbuster directors. But Lynch and Raimi? Come on, boys, do better.
But now on BBC Two we join Alex Cox, who'll tell us a thing or two about tonight's classic cult film, Big Wednesday.
Big Wednesday, which was made in 1978, is a film about the big score in its purest form. 3 American surfers in search of the perfect wave. It was critically unpopular when it first came out. It was accused of being grandiose and pretentious, which it is. But a lot of good films are grandiose and pretentious, including Citizen Kane. The director's name is John Milius. He also co-wrote Dirty Harry, Apocalypse Now, and wrote and directed a magnificent film called Red Dawn. He has the reputation for being the most right-wing film director in Hollywood, which is rather like being the tallest player on a basketball team. He's a good director, though, very highly regarded. I don't know if it's really true about him being extremely right-wing or not. I only saw a photograph of him one time, and he seemed a fairly normal guy, except that he was wearing a Green Beret uniform. I think he's upfront about the fact that he's a loony, though, and we should respect him for that. And he is a very good film director, which is even more deserving of our respect. His films are very well put together. The acting is normally excellent. This film is based on his early days because in his youth he was a surfer, and when you see his name in the titles, the photograph that accompanies the title is of Milius and some friends with their boards. Maybe one of the reasons the film wasn't popular with the critics is that the critics aren't surfers. But if you like the ocean, if you admire these guys who get up really early in the morning and go out where it's really cold and wet, you might like Big Wednesday. It's Milius's American Graffiti. One of the actors in it, Gary Busey, who played Buddy Holly in the Buddy Holly story, taught himself to sing and play guitar for Buddy Holly and learned to swim and surf for this film, Big Wednesday.
Portrayal of life in this divided country and contains strong language and disturbing scenes.
Salvador was directed in 1986 by Oliver Stone. Although it always features in his filmography as Stone's first film as a director, it was actually his third or even fourth. For some reason, his early triumphs are not referred to by critics earnestly intent on evaluating the great man's work. Okay, I'm being a bit facetious. The truth is, the worth of Stone's other films apart, Salvador is a really great film. I first saw it at the film market at the Cannes Film Festival. It was the film's first international screening, and there were 2 other people in the audience. This was, of course, before the success of Platoon, also made by the Stone, John Daly, Derek Gibson team. For my money, Platoon is complete rubbish, a nasty bit of propaganda which suggests that if the poor American GIs had only had better officers, they would have won the Vietnam War. By Salvador, however, I was blown away. I was so impressed by and involved in the film that I couldn't remember where I was. So strong was the film and so authentic that it was completely overpowering, even in a tiny screening room at 3 in the afternoon.
No. No, get out of the car. Get out of the car. Sí, señor.
Whatever you do, Doc. Whatever you do, okay? Don't get on the ground.
Jesus Christ, man, this is fucking scary.
Salvador is based on the experiences of American journalist Richard Boyle, who covered events in El Salvador in the early years of the Reagan regime in Washington. Boyle is a great character, wonderfully played by James Woods, a freakoid ambulance chaser whose partnership with the James Belushi character, Dr. Rock, seems more than a little based on the characters of Hunter Thompson and his American Samoan lawyer, Dr. Gonzo, in the celebrated counterculture narrative, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. In fact, by borrowing so heavily from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Stone has achieved the impossible, created a film with a journalist protagonist whom you actually like. Because it's par for the course for liberal films about foreign policy issues to have a reporter for their hero. Think of The Year of Living Dangerously, The Killing Fields, and Under Fire. All of the miserable propagandistic failures with bland, wishy-washy heroes who spend 2 weeks wherever the action is, then run back to New York to pick up their Pulitzer Prize. Under Fire was a particularly egregious example where the filmmakers went so far as to pretend that the Nicaraguan Revolution was actually won by American journalists. Interesting notion. From my experience, reporters who spend a lot of time in war zones are a lot more like James Woods or Hunter Thompson than like the saintly whiner hero of the killing fields. Face it, war, or as the Americans called the ongoing massacre in El Salvador, low-intensity conflict, is a dirty, nasty, pointless, and horrific business, and any reporter who makes a living out of covering wars is seriously disturbed, which Richard Boyle, as written by Stone and played by Woods, quite clearly is. Salvador is that extremely rare item, a well-made, thoroughly entertaining political film. It does a lot more than the real Boyle did, placing its protagonist at the scene of the murder of Archbishop Romero by a right-wing death squad, and having him on the spot immediately after the Salvadorian army murdered 4 American nuns. It also depicts the political conversion of the American ambassador, played very well by Michael Murphy, a conversion which actually occurred. Ultimately, of course, the film cops out. Following a battle between the army and the FMLN guerrillas who raided the town, rather improbably on horseback, there comes the obligatory scene where the rebels shoot some of their prisoners and Woods runs back and forth shouting, "You're just as bad as each other! You're just as bad as each other!" to both sides. Actually, the line looks like an afterthought, as if it had been dubbed in post-production over Woods' back. Why then does Stone, having depicted a grandiloquent, high-energy but essentially truthful series of events, undercut his own message at the end? In different circumstances, one might blame the studio or the executives, or they forced him to do it. But in this case, the production company is Hemdale, and whatever the vices of Messrs. Daly and Gibson, neither one was ever accused of being a minion of right-wing politicians or liberal aesthetics. I'm afraid it's a case of the director pulling his punches at the last minute, because he's afraid to depict a national liberation movement in too positive a light. In the same way, in his most recent film, Heaven and Earth, it's not the Americans, but the Viet Cong who rape the Vietnamese heroine. This small quibble aside, Salvador is an impressive piece of work. It was made mostly in Mexico by some of Mexico's best film craftspeople. It features some of the better Mexican actors, Salvador Sanchez, René Pereira, and Roberto Sosa, in supporting roles. The editing by Claire Simpson and Carlos Puente is outstanding, and the camera work by a duo of American cinematographers, Bob Richardson and Tom Richmond, is magnificent. Has anything changed in El Salvador since the film was made? Unfortunately, it seems not. In the run-up to the March elections, 40 FMLN candidates were killed by death squads, and the US military has resumed war games with the Salvadorian army. Meanwhile, the country slips further into a cycle of poverty and repression, the reason the Civil War began in the first place. Tonight we present the first of 2 films directed by David Cronenberg. A Canadian biochemistry student who switched to English language and literature, Cronenberg can legitimately be described as the most original director currently working on the North American continent. His films, which are always shot in Canada, Canadian cities doubling for New York or Marrakesh, fall generally within the horror genre. They deal with secret scientific experiments gone wrong, cannibalism, sexual mutation, and epidemic disease. Depending on your point of view, Cronenberg is either a maker of sick exploitation movies or an ascetic prophet of the modern age. Shivers, made in 1975, was his first feature. It dealt with a hotel suddenly ravaged by a sexual virus which drove all the guests insane. Scanners deals in exploding heads and mind control. Rabid, the second film in our double bill tonight, is the story of a woman who mutates into an erotomaniac cannibal. The Dead Zone deals with a man whose precognitive gifts lead him into madness and political assassination. And The Fly is about a man who turns into a giant fly. Tonight's tale is that of Beverly and Elliot Mantle, twin gynecologists from Toronto, whose perverse relationship with their patients and each other leads them into familiarly nightmarish Cronenberg territory. Compared to the maestro's other films, Dead Ringers is remarkably unbloodthirsty. It's based on a book called Twins by Barry Wood and Jack Giesland, and is apparently a true story. Not that it matters. I doubt that the original tale of the Mantles was any more like Dead Ringers than Cronenberg's Naked Lunch was like the William Burroughs book. Cronenberg films are always first and foremost Cronenberg films. The only compromise to which Dead Ringers had to submit was a title change, the word twins having been appropriated by an Arnold Schwarzenegger film. In some ways, Dead Ringers is unique, however. It's the first Cronenberg film which features really good acting. Now, I know there are those who will insist that James Woods was good in Videodrome or Christopher Walken excellent in The Dead Zone. But to my taste, the acting in the great man's films has always been deliriously wooden. Dead Ringers, on the other hand, has a genuinely fine performance by Jeremy Irons, who plays the twin gynecological brothers. It's photographically remarkable too, laid down on film via a process called motion control, whereby the camera's moves can be duplicated via computer animation, thus enabling Mr. Irons to play one brother, then get changed, go back and play the other brother, while the camera tracks ahead of them, round corners and through doors. Now, in the old days of film about twin brothers, you may recall the camera had to remain in one position, and there was always a blue line running down the middle of the screen. The excellent director of photography was Peter Suchitsky. Jeremy Irons is reported to have said that the way he differentiated between his two roles was by always having one brother on the ball of his feet, the other on his heels. Can it be true? Or is there more to his extraordinary performance? Judge for yourself as you relax, kick back, and enjoy Dead Ringers. Did you like that? Now MovieDrome proudly presents one of the finest cult films of all time, Rabid, by David Cronenberg. Cronenberg is, as we have said, the director of The Fly remake, and Shivers, and The Naked Lunch, Scanners, and The Dead Zone, a venerable roster of cult horror movies surpassed by no other practitioner of the genre. Not Wes Craven, not Todd Browning, not Mario Bava, not Dario Argento, not John Carpenter, not even the ineffable James Whale made as many genuinely weird and unsettling horror films. Of the above-mentioned, only Argento has as thoroughly thought out a worldview and consistent take on vicious horror lurking behind the most mundane things. Yet Argento is preoccupied by a rather infantile misogyny of the De Palma brand, and like De Palma makes ultimately boring films. Cronenberg, on the other hand, transcends misogyny and even misanthropy. He stands like Philante in Moliere's play, aside from things, disgusted by them, yet amused and physically and fiscally involved as well. The ultimate celluloid cynic. Cronenberg's movies portray a sense of physical horror at human sexuality unmatched in any other charted area of cinema. In addition, his films are preoccupied with the mechanics of surgery and the transmission of disease-bearing viruses. Many of the early ones, including Rabid, bear a considerable debt to Night of the Living Dead. Cronenberg is one of the only English-speaking directors allowed the luxury of an unhappy ending. Could the unspoken rumor that Cronenberg is actually a renegade U.S. Army colonel from Fort Detrick Biological Weapons Station, Maryland, attempting to blow the whistle on secret releases of airborne viral toxins in the New York subway system really be true? No, it could not. Cronenberg is, as we have said, a Canadian. I had the pleasure of reading one of his scripts in the assistant to the producer's office, and it was a highly pleasurable experience because there were no embarrassing and elementary mistakes of spelling and grammar, such as you normally find in screenplays and directors' scripts. In fact, there were no mistakes at all. I mean, this guy is not only a great filmmaker, he's literate. Rabid is, in my opinion, Cronenberg's best. It was made in 1976 and is the story of one Rose, played by Marilyn Chambers, whose unfortunate involvement in a motorbike accident leads to bizarre and disastrous results. Marilyn Chambers, you may recall, as a child was the Miss Purity soap advertising symbol all across the USA, and in adulthood became a major porno star. Combining the twin American obsessions of cleanliness and sex,
Ms. Chambers is the quintessential Cronenberg actor.
Next on MovieDrome, life in and out of the saddle. Steve McQueen and Ida Lupino in Sam Peckinpah's Junior Bonner.
Now, bringing BBC Two's Kennedy night to a close, slightly later than scheduled, a MovieDrome special. Alex Cox introduces a highly charged political thriller, The Parallax View.
In September 1963, a man called Richard Case Nagel walked into a bank in El Paso, Texas, and fired 3 shots into the wall. He then sat down outside the bank and waited to be arrested. When the police came for him, he surrendered peacefully, telling them he wanted to be in federal custody because the President of the United States was shortly to be assassinated, and he did not want to be the patsy when the assassination occurred. Nagel was a U.S. Army intelligence agent, and, if we can believe a new book about him, also a Soviet spy. That in itself is not implausible. Double agents with questionable loyalties are the stuff of John le Carré novels and of actual spycraft. Consider our own Kim Philby or Anthony Blunt. Agents are always being turned and working for both sides simultaneously. What's interesting about Nagel's claims, reported in the book The Man Who Knew Too Much, by the American journalist Dick Russell, is that he says Lee Harvey Oswald was a double agent too. You don't have to believe all of what Nagel says. He's a slippery customer. He served several years in jail for bank robbery, although he made no actual attempt to rob the bank. And he was later arrested by Stasi agents on the wrong side of the old East German border and exchanged for one of their top spies. But for the record, Nagel says that he, Oswald, and a number of other military men were sent by U.S. Army or Naval intelligence to various Iron Curtain countries posing as defectors. Their mission was to win the confidence of their KGB or Stasi minders, plant false information, and come back with the real goods. In the case of Lee Oswald, the real goods might even have been Marina, the woman whom he married there. She was the niece of a high-ranking Russian intelligence colonel whom the West was anxious to have defect. Nagel says that he himself became uncertain of his loyalties. He alleges Oswald, a mediocre marksman whom the Marines had uncharacteristically taught to speak Russian, actually went over to the other side and returned to the United States a Soviet agent, just as the right-wing conspiracists always said he was, in fact. Now, on the 30th anniversary of the JFK assassination, we're presented with TV documentaries and books like Case Closed and Conspiracy of One, which, surprise, surprise, reveal that Oswald really did act all alone. He wasn't a spy at all. Not for them, not for us. He didn't have any friends or co-conspirators. I really find it risible to see these CIA and KGB men shaking their heads and saying, he was a nut. We had nothing to do with him. Well, what do you think they're going to say? These men are paid professional spies, employers of assassins and killers. I question the common sense of any TV or print reporter who journeys to Minsk or Langley, Virginia, pokes a camera in the face of Lee Harvey Oswald's case officer, and expects to get the true truth out of the guy. It's a trifle naive, to say the least. The true truth about the JFK assassination was probably known to most of the major intelligence organizations within a few days, if not a few hours, of its occurrence. Of course the Russians have a big file on who killed JFK and Robert Kennedy. They wouldn't be doing their jobs if they didn't. In the same way, the FBI must have a file on who killed Enrico Mattei, the Italian industrialist who went up against the Texan oil boys in the 1960s. The Indians undoubtedly know who blew up General Zia's plane. The Nicaraguans certainly know who ordered the murder of Olaf Palme. They've been dropping hints to that effect for years. Maybe the French can tell us who killed Hilda Murrell. But of course they won't. Because the purpose of secret intelligence is that it be kept secret. Not from our enemies, because they know already. Nor from our allies, because they're spying on us too. But from us, because it's very important we don't know. Now, 30 years on from the most notable political assassination of the century, let's consider a few of the others, and there have been a lot, and how the media have explained them to us. Mattei, General Zia, President of Pakistan, General Torrijos, President of Panama, all died in plane crashes. Reason for the accident, unknown. Dr. Martin Luther King, murdered by a lone assassin, definitely no conspiracy there. Palme, murdered on the street by a lone madman who evaded the police for months. Well, no conspiracy there either. San Francisco Mayor Moscone and gay supervisor Harvey Milk, murdered by a man who'd been driven temporarily mad by eating candy bars? No one else involved? Last year, Petra Kelly, murdered apparently by her lover, who went mad and shot himself as well. No conspiracy at all. Well, maybe. It's comforting, perhaps, to imagine all these murders, mostly of left-wing politicians, were the work of lone loonies, unpaid for and unplanned. But what if they weren't? What if there really were conspiracies behind one or more of these crimes? Which brings us to the Parallax View, a feature film directed in 1974 by Alan J. Pakula. In it, Warren Beatty and Paula Prentice play two reporters in Seattle.
Somebody's trying to kill me.
A lone assassin murder atop the Space Needle sets them thinking, what if the assassin didn't act alone? What if a conspiracy was involved? In this case, the murder itself seems modeled on the Robert Kennedy assassination, with its gun-wielding waiter, its elusive second assassin, and even a briefly glimpsed girl in a polka-dot dress. The aftermath, however, is pure JFK, a Warren Commission-style cover-up, followed by a series of mysterious deaths of witnesses and journalists. The JFK murder really was rough on reporters and witnesses. The catalogue of witnesses who died from heart attacks, car and plane crashes, gun accidents, karate chops to the neck, etc., is very long and justly notorious. What's less known is the small core of journalists who lost their lives investigating the case. Tonight, Paula Prentice plays a reporter clearly based on the popular American columnist Dorothy Killigan, the only journalist allowed a private interview with Jack Ruby, who died of an overdose of alcohol and barbiturates after publishing several articles indicating a conspiracy was involved. Two other reporters who dug into the Jack Ruby story also died, one of them shot in the head by a patrolman in Long Beach City Police Headquarters. The Parallax View was co-written by Lorenzo Semple Jr., who penned the equally paranoid 3 Days of the Condor, along with the early Batman TV shows. He has a fine, dark sense of humor, as in the scene where Beatty finds himself aboard a plane that's carrying a bomb. The excellent cinemascope photography is by Gordon Willis, who also shot The Godfather and many of Woody Allen's films. The Parallax View was influential both on Pakula's own All the President's Men and on Oliver Stone's JFK, which revitalized the media's interest in the Kennedy assassination and contributed to the release of a large quantity of doctored U.S. government files. An uncharitable listener might suggest that John Williams' soundtrack for JFK was not uninfluenced by Michael Small's excellent musical score for Parallax View. Pakula's film inevitably refers to the Manchurian Candidate, that prophetic tale of double agents, brainwashing and political assassination, magnificently filmed by John Frankenheimer in 1962. Interestingly, Frankenheimer also made a film about an attempted military coup in the United States, 7 Days in May, the same year Kennedy was killed. Who done it? In tonight's film, a mysterious company called the Parallax Corporation, appears to be hiring hitmen and patsies in order to commit perfect political crimes. Jim Garrison, the New Orleans DA, who was the hero of Oliver Stone's movie, actually accused the Canadian-based company Permindex of doing much the same thing, hiring political hitmen to kill Kennedy and to attempt to kill de Gaulle. 70% of the adult American population believed their president was murdered by a conspiracy. Who was behind the conspiracy depends on the political and social inclinations of the person that you talk to. Right-wingers still claim from time to time that Khrushchev or Castro did it, via their commie protege Oswald. Almost everyone in Texas seems to think that Lyndon Johnson had a hand in it. People on the left are not slow to point out that Richard Nixon flew out of Dallas on the morning President Kennedy died. There's tremendous circumstantial evidence that the mafia was involved, not least the use of mafia hitman Ruby to silence the alleged assassin. Mark Lane and Jim Garrison always said the CIA did it. Kennedy didn't like the CIA, they said, because it led him into a political fiasco at the Bay of Pigs. He threatened to splinter it into 1,000 pieces, and he fired CIA head Allen Dulles and Deputy Director Charles P. Cabell, whose brother was the mayor of Dallas on the fateful day. It's possible. But the thesis of Dick Russell's book, The Man Who Knew Too Much, presents a new version. The CIA, says Russell, was by the early 60s pretty thoroughly infiltrated by the Russians. Remember, CIA is theoretically a civilian body which has fought turf wars with the US military since its inception in 1947. Russell speculates that the clues pointing towards CIA as culprits in the assassination were in fact false, laid there by Texas oil men and an extreme right-wing faction in the US military. This group, stretching beyond the United States, in fact an international fascist cabal, had the president killed. They picked Oswald as the patsy, Russell says, because he had intelligence fingerprints all over him. American, Soviet, and remember he was also a paid informant of the Dallas FBI. He was the perfect fall guy, disgruntled, alienated, knowing just a little bit too much. His death, and that of a few witnesses, satisfies the different power groups, allowing them to maintain much of their status, while the conspirators move a little higher up the ladder and settle comfortably into place. If it was a coup, it was something of a gentlemanly one, compared to the bloodshed following Pinochet's takeover of Chile or Sukarno's reign of terror in Indonesia. All quite civilized, except for those witnesses, of course, and to Dorothy Killigan. One of their top spies. But for the record, Nagel says that he, Oswald, and a number of other military men were sent by US Army or Naval intelligence to various Iron Curtain countries posing as defectors. Their mission was to win the confidence of their KGB or Stasi minders, plant false information, and come back with the real goods. In the case of Lee Oswald, the real goods might even have been Marina, the woman whom he married there. She was the niece of a high-ranking Russian intelligence colonel whom the West was anxious to have defect. Nagel says that he himself became uncertain of his loyalties. He alleges Oswald, a mediocre marksman whom the Marines had uncharacteristically taught to speak Russian, actually went over to the other side and returned to the United States a Soviet agent, just as the right-wing conspiracists always said he was, in fact. Now, on the 30th anniversary of the JFK assassination, we're presented with TV documentaries and books like Case Closed and Conspiracy of One, which, surprise, surprise, reveal that Oswald really did act all alone. He wasn't a spy at all. Not for them, not for us. He didn't have any friends or co-conspirators. I really find it risible to see these CIA and KGB men shaking their heads and saying, "Ah, he was a nut. We had nothing to do with him." Well, what do you think they're going to say? These men are paid professional spies, employers of assassins and killers. I question the common sense of any TV or print reporter who journeys to Minsk or Langley, Virginia, pokes a camera in the face of Lee Harvey Oswald's case officer, and expects to get the true truth out of the guy. It's a trifle naive, to say the least. The true truth about the JFK assassination was probably known to most of the major intelligence organizations within a few days, if not a few hours, of its occurrence. Of course the Russians have a big file on who killed JFK and Robert Kennedy. They wouldn't be doing their jobs if they didn't. In the same way, the FBI must have a file on who killed Enrico Mattei, the Italian industrialist who went up against the Texan oil boys in the 1960s. The Indians undoubtedly know who blew up General Zia's plane. The Nicaraguans certainly know who ordered the murder of Olaf Palme. They've been dropping hints to that effect for years. Maybe the French can tell us who killed Hilda Murrell. But of course they won't. Because the purpose of secret intelligence is that it be kept secret. Not from our enemies, because they know already. Nor from our allies, because they're spying on us too. But from us, because it's very important we don't know. Now, 30 years on from the most notable political assassination of the century, let's consider a few of the others, and there have been a lot, and how the media have explained them to us. Mattei, General Zia, from the most notable political assassination of the century, let's consider a few of the others, and there have been a lot, and how the media have explained them to us. Mattei, General Zia, President of Pakistan, General Torrijos, President of Panama, all died in plane crashes. Reason for the accident, unknown. Dr. Martin Luther King, murdered by a lone assassin, definitely no conspiracy there. Palme, murdered on the street by a lone madman who evaded the police for months. Well, no conspiracy there either. San Francisco Mayor Moscone and gay supervisor Harvey Milk, murdered by a man who'd been driven temporarily mad by eating candy bars? No one else involved? Last year, Petra Kelly, murdered apparently by her lover, who went mad and shot himself as well. No conspiracy at all. Well, maybe. It's comforting, perhaps, to imagine all these murders, mostly of left-wing politicians, were the work of lone loonies, unpaid for and unplanned. But what if they weren't? What if there really were conspiracies behind one or more of these crimes? Which brings us to the Parallax View, a feature film directed in 1974 by Alan J. Pakula. In it, Warren Beatty and Paula Prentice play two reporters in Seattle.
Somebody's trying to kill me.
A lone assassin murder atop the Space Needle sets them thinking, what if the assassin didn't act alone? What if a conspiracy was involved? In this case, the murder itself seems modeled on the Robert Kennedy assassination, with its gun-wielding waiter, its elusive second assassin, and even a briefly glimpsed girl in a polka-dot dress. The aftermath, however, is pure JFK, a Warren Commission-style cover-up, followed by a series of mysterious deaths of witnesses and journalists. The JFK murder really was rough on reporters and witnesses. The catalogue of witnesses who died from heart attacks, car and plane crashes, gun accidents, karate chops to the neck, etc., is very long and justly notorious. What's less known is the small core of journalists who lost their lives investigating the case. Tonight, Paula Prentice plays a reporter clearly based on the popular American columnist Dorothy Killigan, the only journalist allowed a private interview with Jack Ruby, who died of an overdose of alcohol and barbiturates after publishing several articles indicating a conspiracy was involved. Two other reporters who dug into the Jack Ruby story also died, one of them shot in the head by a patrolman in Long Beach City Police Headquarters. The Parallax View was co-written by Lorenzo Semple Jr., who penned the equally paranoid 3 Days of the Condor, along with the early Batman TV shows. He has a fine, dark sense of humor, as in the scene where Beatty finds himself aboard a plane that's carrying a bomb. Double agents with questionable loyalties are the stuff of John le Carré novels and of actual spycraft. Consider our own Kim Philby or Anthony Blunt. Agents are always being turned and working for both sides simultaneously. What's interesting about Nagel's claims, reported in the book The Man Who Knew Too Much by the American journalist Dick Russell, is that he says Lee Harvey Oswald was a double agent too. You don't have to believe all of what Nagel says. He's a slippery customer. He served several years in jail for bank robbery, although he made no actual attempt to rob the bank. And he was later arrested by Stasi agents on the wrong side of the old East German border and exchanged for one of their top spies. But for the record, Nagel says that he, Oswald, and a number of other military men were sent by US Army or Naval Intelligence to various Iron Curtain countries posing as defectors. Their mission was to win the confidence of their KGB or Stasi minders, plant false information, and come back with the real goods. In the case of Lee Oswald, the real goods might even have been Marina, the woman whom he married there. She was the niece of a high-ranking Russian intelligence colonel whom the West was anxious to have defect. Nagel says that he himself became uncertain of his loyalties. He alleges Oswald, a mediocre marksman whom the Marines had uncharacteristically taught to speak Russian, actually went over to the other side and returned to the United States a Soviet agent, just as the right-wing conspiracists always said he was, in fact. Now, on the 30th anniversary of the JFK assassination, we're presented with TV documentaries and books like Case Closed and Conspiracy of One, which, surprise, surprise, reveal that Oswald really did act all alone. He wasn't a spy at all. Not for them, not for us. He didn't have any friends or co-conspirators. I really find it risible to see these CIA and KGB men shaking their heads and saying, "Ah, he was a nut. We had nothing to do with him." Well, what do you think they're going to say? These men are paid professional spies, employers of assassins and killers. I question the common sense of any TV or print reporter who journeys to Minsk or Langley, Virginia, pokes a camera in the face of Lee Harvey Oswald's case officer, and expects to get the true truth out of the guy. It's a trifle naive, to say the least. The true truth about the JFK assassination was probably known to most of the major intelligence organizations within a few days, if not a few hours, of its occurrence. Of course the Russians have a big file on who killed JFK and Robert Kennedy. They wouldn't be doing their jobs if they didn't. In the same way, the FBI must have a file on who killed Enrico Mattei, the Italian industrialist who went up against the Texan oil boys in the 1960s. The Indians undoubtedly know who blew